So, we finally reached the two black sheep of the Frosty the Snowman franchise. So, let's start off with the first one being Frosty Returns, which had its premiere on CBS on December 1, 1992. It was directed and produced by Bill Melendez. His co-director was Everett Brown. His co-producer was Eric Casimiro. It was written by Oliver Goldstick and Jim Lewis, with music by Mark Mothersbaugh and Dennis Hannigan, and it stars the voices of Jonathan Winters, John Goodman, Elisabeth Moss, Michael Patrick Carter, Brian Doyle Murray, Andrea Martin, and Jan Hooks. Now, I first saw this, also the same thing can be said of the original Frosty the Snowman, in Teletoon when I was basically spending my Christmas time in Toronto, Canada. For a while, I thought it was kind of enjoyable, but not really that great, until I did some further research on the sequel, finding out that there were people that pretty much hated this thing, and even to the point where Rotten Tomatoes garnered it a total of 18%. And even as I watched the film again before making this review, I actually found out that it wasn't really as enjoyable as it once was when I first watched it in Canada. So I was kind of disappointed with this sequel. So let's find out, starting with the story. So the story isn't really anything new or fresh or anything that's really interesting. Basically, it involves a young girl by the name of Holly DiCarlo, who is also, for some reason, an aspiring magician. And when there is this huge snowstorm that hits her town, well, people complain about it, and the kids seem to be okay with it and all that. And one day, as she's about to do a little bit of a magic trick on her only friend Charles, her hat flies away and ends up landing on the very familiar Frosty the Snowman. Now, basically, I didn't really care too much about the story. I felt like it had a lot of inconsistencies, especially when it came to the kids. Now, in the beginning, the kids said that they loved the snow, but later on, during Charles's report of how snow is, the kids start hating it. And I find myself wondering, isn't there something wrong with the continuity of everything that has happened here so far? And don't get me started on the whole plot with the whole new product called the whole Snow Wheeze Away product. Yeah, basically, I didn't care too much of the story. I felt like it was also hammering in this sort of environmental message, which really came out of left field. And not to mention, there were just too many inconsistencies to try to keep track of. So I'm not really impressed with the story. And this is done by the same guy who has done the likes of Garfield and has helped out on the Peanuts, Bill Melendez. I love the guy. So what's he doing screwing up in this thing? I'll never know. Maybe this might be one of his duds, so maybe in the long run I could forgive him, but this is still a dud. So as a story in relation to Frosty the Snowman, I was totally unimpressed, and it was just disappointing. And then we get to the animation. Now, the animation is pretty much the only decent factor of this TV movie. Now, it does try to live up to the original animation from the original Frosty the Snowman, but just because the animation is still relatively good to look at doesn't mean it also has its share of inconsistencies, like how some characters move and how certain frames are. It almost feels like a little bit of a mess, but regardless, the animation is still rather decent. It manages to be colorful, it manages to be kind of bright, and it's actually okay, though marred with some inconsistencies. The music, well, what more can you expect from a gentleman like Mark Mothersbaugh? He managed to compose a really decent score, especially with the incidental music. Now, if there's one song that was sort of okay, but not really anything to write home about, it's Let There Be Snow. It's catchy, but totally forgettable. But that said, with Mark Motherspaugh's incidental music composing, I thought it was okay. I thought it managed to be a lot decent than what I could ever give it credit for. Besides, he's the same guy who's worked on music from Rugrats, so you could really tell those types of beats and those types of musical arrangements that can be found in this Christmas special. So you could really tell from that touch that it was him who composed a lot of the music. So on the long run, the music was okay, but sometimes I feel like the Let There Be Snow song was rather forgettable, if kind of decent. And then we get to the characters, starting with the main heroine, Holly DiCarlo. There's nothing to her. I didn't really care too much about her as a character, because all she was for me was, she was just your typical nice girl who is quite ambitious, quite steely, quite willful, and quite spunky, and a little bit hard-headed, but she still means well. There's nothing too deep or great about her character, but there's nothing too bad about her either. She's just there. And then we get her friend Charles. Honestly, I didn't really care about him. I felt like he was just a clone of Marcy from the Peanuts, albeit with less personality and a little bit more of a wet blanket before the end of the film. So there's nothing too great about him. With Frosty, well, he's okay, but at times I felt like he kind of missed that sort of charm and charisma that he used to have in the original version. But still, he's pretty much the best thing by default, given the fact that he's also the titular hero. Then we get the main villain, who is Mr. Twitchell. Now, he's kind of forgettable as a villain. I didn't really care too much about his plans. He's just there. And then the narrator, who's basically Jonathan Winters. Now, the narrator, he serves little to no purpose other than to just spout exposition and kind of act like he needs a vacation and wanting to sip on cocoa. And at times he's just there for plot convenience. That's just it. Then we get Holly's mother, Lily. Totally forgettable as a character. She's just your typical concerned mom who just happens to be pretty protective of her own daughter. And then we get Miss Carbuncle, the teacher. She's just the strict teacher, that's it. And all the other kid characters weren't really that memorable. So it goes without saying that I'm not really impressed with the cast of characters. They did not really have anything special or interesting, and I felt like the only character that I kind of felt entertained by a bit was Mr. Twitchell, and that was just it. Frosty was rather entertaining, but, well, he's kind of lost a little bit of his touch here. The voice acting, for the most part, was mostly hit and miss. I mean, Jonathan Winters does a pretty good job as the narrator given the circumstance, but I really miss the likes of Jimmy Durant and Andy Griffith. Heck, I'll stick to Jimmy Durant a lot more as the narrator. With John Goodman as Frosty the Snowman, well, he's okay, but I felt like he was trying to emulate Jackie Vernon's portrayal of this wonderful character. Here, it sounds like he's trying to sound like him. He's trying to impersonate him. I felt like he was just trying to really get all those nuances that make Jackie Vernon a great Frosty. With Elisabeth Moss as Holly, well, given the circumstances, she's okay. But the big problem is that sometimes her acting can be quite inconsistent. Like the final scene in which she's supposed to portray herself as a lot more passionate and with fire. Here, she just sounded very monotone. There were some good moments here and there, but her performance was marred by inconsistencies. with Michael Patrick Carter as Charles. Well, he's okay, but I didn't really get into his character. Andrea Martin does an okay job as Miss Carbuncle, but her character is just totally wasted. Now, I actually kind of like Brian Doyle Murray as a voice actor. He has a very distinct, stringent voice that has made him very well known in a lot of comedic roles, like that of Mr. Pesky from The Buzz on Maggie, and Coach Gills from My Gym Partner's a Monkey, just to name a few of the roles that he's done in the past. With this role, well, he seems to do a pretty good job with it, and I could tell that he kind of enjoys this type of role, but it's almost nothing to write home about. So the voice acting was marred by some inconsistencies, though the voice actors themselves do a pretty good job. And also, Jan Hooks as Lily DiCarlo was good, but her character was completely wasted. So here we have a good amount of voice actors and voice actresses who kind of didn't really have a lot of great material, especially with the likes of John Goodman and even Brian Doyle Murray. So overall, looking back at this, I'm rather unimpressed with the sequel. I won't say that it's the worst Christmas special I've seen. I mean, that honor still goes to Home Alone 4. But you know what? It's not as bad as, let's say, Grandma Got Run Over by a Reindeer, or Eight Crazy Nights, or even Itsudate My Santa. It's very forgettable, and I wouldn't really recommend it. So I decided to give Frosty's Return a 2 out of 5. Why am I ranking this as high as I thought I should? Well, the animation and the music saved it. The others were just very forgettable. Of course, there were inconsistencies in the animation, but the music was something that was pretty good. The voice acting at times was met with inconsistencies, but it's still okay in terms of performance. The rest was very forgettable. I would really say just skip this thing. However, there is yet another black sheep to this franchise, and we will get to that later. So, tune in for that.